Hang on. We'll get you out. Those were words that were spoken by some construction workers. They were in a bad situation. Maybe I can tell you the story. These construction workers were refinishing the inside of the Columbia 2, which is the tallest smokestack in Wisconsin, 650 feet high. It was an interesting job. They had built a platform made out of aluminum, covered it with plywood, and took 4 steel cables and brought them right through the inside of the chimney stack, 650 feet high, tied it to the catwalk. On each of the cables were 4 motors, and the motors would bring the platform up and down. It worked beautifully. They went right up 650 feet, 60 stories high, and started refinishing the inside of that smokestack. By the end of the day, they were about halfway down, and they were just going to do one more section. So they turned on all the motors again and gradually moved down another 6 feet. They turned off motor number 1, 2, and 3, but motor number 4 would not turn off. They were frantic about it, just clicking that motor as fast as they could. And as that side of the platform began to come down, you can visualize what would happen now. The platform became absolutely vertical. These men scrambled for their lives, grabbed onto the steel cables, and yelled out, "Headache!" which I guess is the construction workers' logo for things falling below. And all their equipment fell down 300 feet. The men below cleared the area, and after the dust had settled, they saw what happened to those men. There they were, hanging on these cables. Now, there were 2 intercoms on the cables, and the men down below said, "Hang on. We're going to get you out." Well, how long would you be able to hang on in a situation like that? Are the muscles of your arms and hand and wrists and forearms strong enough to hold your body weight? Or would you be slipping? You couldn't afford to slip. The cable was made out of splintered steel, so if you slid, the steel would go through your hands. How long would you be able to hold on? Well, these men were given every time they would hear this intercom, "Hang on, we're going to get you out." But those men down below did not know what they could do to get them out. They couldn't get a ladder up there, 350 feet. They finally called a rescue helicopter. He had a basket within his helicopter. All he'd have to do was thread the basket through the top of the chimney stack, and the mission would be accomplished. The wind was blowing so hard, though, that when that helicopter pilot got up there and tried to thread that basket into the top of that chimney stack, that basket would just be whipping through the breeze, and there was just nothing he could do. Finally, a storm came along, and he had to call off the operations for his own safety. It started pouring. The water started lubricating that cable. The men started to slide, and then their blood became their own lubricant. The men from down below said, "Hang on, we're going to get you out." And the men didn't know what they were going to do. How long would it be? Hours had passed, and there didn't seem to be any sign of rescue. Well, finally, the storm cleared after 21 hours. Were the men still there? Well, they rescued one of them right away, and the pilot eventually took him out, brought him to safety. He went right back up there just as quickly as he could, and while he was down on the ground unloading the other man, a big cloud came right over the top of that chimney stack, 60 stories high. It's pretty high. He went up there. He couldn't see where the whole of that stack was. He couldn't get that close to it. He would destroy the helicopter. It was trying to like thread a needle, and you can't see what you're doing. They kept on telling the men, "Hang on, we're going to get you out." The man thought to himself, I don't know how much longer I can hang on. The muscles in his hands were cramping. No food, no sleep. 21 hours had passed. No water, no rest. How could you hang on? Lactic acid building up by the glycogen used in your muscles. The burning sensation was almost too much to bear. He said there was a velvety blackness down below. It would have been easy to let go. Every time he felt like letting go, they'd say, "Hang on, we're going to get you out." 41 hours later, they got him out. They brought these 2 men out, and they said, "How did you do it? How could you hold on for 41 hours? How is that humanly possible?" And do you know what he said? It was the encouragement that I received from down below. Now, that story is not about Jehovah's Witnesses. It's a Reader's Digest story, drama in real life. It's unbelievable, too. But it helps to illustrate a point, and that is what a powerful thing encouragement is. Now, we've talked about stress this week, and obviously the things that we have to do to cope with it effectively, and we've tried to analyze it. We've taken the stress of the ministry specifically on Thursday night, see how we can endure that. But there are so many problems that many of us go through, changes, traumas, life changes, that can affect all of us. There's discouragements that we face that sometimes overwhelm us. It may be discouragement in your own reaction to a given situation. It could be discouragement because you have a situation that can't be changed. It could be discouragement in the performance of your mate, or the elders in a congregation, or even a traveling overseer. A person may be an orphan, a widow, may be terminally ill. And those things can be discouraging. And so in a sense, we really owe it to one another to be an encouragement to each other. But I'll tell you, you probably know this to be true. That's not always the case with us. We are not always empathetic with one another. You think we would be. We're all humans in the same boat, right? But being in the same boat does not make you empathetic. Let me illustrate. Let's say we were all in the same boat after a big ship had sunk. We're out on the sea, it's raining and storming, and you see the ship going down below. There's no rescue in sight, and somebody pops up in this lifeboat and says, "It's awfully cold out here." Now, what is everybody going to say to that person? Are they going to look at him empathetically? Or are they going to look at him and say, "Yeah, we know it's cold out here, now quit complaining"? Now, there may be, it'd be rare, but there may be one person in that lifeboat who'll look at that person and go over to them and put their arm around them and say, "You know, you're right. It is cold out here. Maybe if we put our bodies together, maybe we can keep warm." That would be an encouraging person, wouldn't it? So you see, sometimes when we go through a life experience, we feel, well, you know, if we had to cut the mustard, you cut the mustard. We're not always empathetic as a result of being human and going through the same life experiences. And yet, we can be such a tremendous influence because we don't know when somebody walks into the Kingdom Hall whether or not they're just about ready to let go. And if our encouraging words may enable them to hold on just a little bit longer. Really, as Christians, we're almost obligated to be that way for one another. In the book of Hebrews chapter 10, how many thousands of times have we read this? Let's zero in on one particular word in this verse and see if it'll give us maybe a different light on the matter, because we know it's translated from the Greek language, and sometimes analyzing the Greek can give us a little richer meaning to it. In verse 24 it says, "Let us consider one another to incite to love and fine works, not forsaking the gathering of ourselves together, as some have the custom, but encouraging one another, and all the more so as you behold the day drawing near." Now, the word encourage in the Greek language is parakaleo. I probably won't say that when I'm serving the Greek congregation, but I think that's the way you pronounce that. And the word parakaleo has a sense of it meaning to call somebody to your side to give them assistance. In other words, it's not enough just to come to the Kingdom Hall and occupy a seat. Believe me, that's encouraging, but that's not encouraging enough. Paul didn't say, "Some forsake the gathering of ourselves together. All you have to do is gather together." He didn't say that. He didn't make it that simple. He didn't say gathering together was fulfilling what we might be able to do for each other. He said that we have to encourage one another while we're here. I'm sure you all make efforts at doing that. But we can see how vital that is, especially in the stressful times that we're living in today. And yet, we have to be realistic about this. We have to be reasonable. Just because we walk into a Kingdom Hall full of Jehovah's Witnesses doesn't mean that because we have some particular problem, that all of a sudden 12 people are going to come over to us and give us just the right words that we need to make us feel great again. Is that realistic? I don't think it is, do you? Why isn't it realistic? Well, first of all, a lot of times people don't really know what our problems are. Isn't that true? We come in, we look great, even if we're dying inside. But we don't show that. Well, that's good. We're not going to wear all our problems out on our shirt sleeve. Not everybody knows what we're going through. Some people silently suffer, and they do well at it. Others don't. Another thing that happens is sometimes people know what we're going through, but they really don't know what to say. They don't know what to do about it. Out of fear of making it worse, that they should say the wrong thing, they don't say anything at all. And then we have to acknowledge the element, hopefully it's rare, is that we do know what's wrong, we might have the right words, but we don't have the motivation. That's a possibility too. All that leads to our own human failing, our lack of perception in matters, our lack of ability to deal with problems effectively, or maybe even our lack of desire to be as much a help as we should be. Now, when that situation comes about, how are we going to hang on? Who's going to tell us, hang on? Well, we know that we have one friend who will never let us down. Obviously, that's Jehovah. And it's interesting to see the way he's described in the book of 2 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 3 and 4. You're going to notice a word that's used repeatedly in these two verses. Just see if it stands out to you as we read it. Blessed be the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, the Father of tender mercies and the God of all comfort, who comforts us in all our tribulation, that we may be able to comfort those in any sort of tribulation through the comfort with which we ourselves are being comforted by God. Well, outstandingly there, the word comfort just stands out in lights, doesn't it? And you know what's interesting? The word comfort is the same Greek word, parakaleo, that's translated encouragement in Hebrews 10:24 and 5. In other words, Jehovah is a God of encouragement. And he promises to be there for us when no one else can be, or when no one else wants to be, or when no one else knows how to be. He will be there as our source of encouragement. And if he is a source of encouragement to us, then Paul is saying maybe we can learn something from it and naturally try to be an encouragement to one another. But he promises never to fail us, even when we inadvertently fail each other. Now, how will Jehovah be a God of comfort to us? That's the question now. What's interesting is that the writer of this book, 2 Corinthians, the Apostle Paul, gives his own personal experience as to how Jehovah was a God of comfort to him. And it might be well worth our reading. It's found in the book of 2 Corinthians. This is in chapter 12. It starts in verse 7. It was really loving of Paul to write this, and of course for Jehovah to inspire him to write it. Let's just analyze his circumstance. We all view Paul as a fine brother, a spiritual man. But notice what happened to him here. It says, therefore, that I might not feel overly exalted, there was given me a thorn in the flesh, an angel of Satan to keep slapping me, that I might not feel overly exalted. Now, Paul describes this as a thorn in the flesh, and the Greek word for thorn is actually stake, so it kind of gives you a little bigger picture of what this was, not a little tiny rosebush thorn. The New World Translation Committee didn't argue over whether it was a stake or a thorn. The question is not how big it is, the question is how sharp it is, where it's being pressed in on your flesh, and how hard it's being pressed in. True? So this was something that was really getting to Paul. And you see what he compares it to, just to help us visualize the pain he was feeling. He said it was like an angel of Satan that kept slapping him. Now, I don't know if you've ever been slapped in the face. That's a terrible experience. You know, for somebody to look at your soft cheek and warm up their hand and with all their might just come across and implant their fingerprints in your flesh, that can literally knock you out. It can even blind you. Imagine if you had to go through that every day. You may wonder if it's worth getting up in the morning. And this is exactly what Paul was feeling. When Satan slaps you in the face, it's not a little light tap on your cheek. He's going to really wallop you. He's going to try to demoralize you. And that's the way Paul felt. He felt demoralized. Paul was not a man who was not unaccustomed to pain. So, this was not a complainer. Paul was stoned 3 times. They thought he was dead. You stone the man, you throw rocks at him, he's bleeding, you kick him, he doesn't move, he's dead, you walk away, and each time Paul gets up, he goes preaching the next day. But the residual effects of that kind of brutal punishment to the body must have been unbelievable in years to come. Paul received 5 strokes, he received 5 scourgings, some from the Romans, some from the Jews. A scourging was 40 strokes less 1. 15 on the bare chest, 12 on each shoulder. Just imagine the residual effects of that kind of punishment to the body, besides being robbed and beaten and shipwrecked. He was not a complainer. These things didn't hold him back, but this was getting to him. It was almost more than he felt he could bear. Now, what was it? We don't know. We really don't know. I'm sure you're familiar with the possible interpretations that the Watchtower has given to this. One interpretation they give to it is the fact that Paul might have had poor eyesight. They use the book of Galatians as a basis for that interpretation. In that book, he says he wrote with large letters. It's also found in the book of Galatians that the brothers he said that brothers in Galatia would have been willing to gouge out their eyes for him. Now, that may have been an expression, but it also may have had more meaning to it because they may have wished they could have given their eyes to Paul. But one of the most revealing texts that makes that a possible commentary is in Acts, where Paul spoke sharply to the high priest and was quickly censured for that because that was against the Mosaic law. And Paul apologized. He says, I didn't know who I was talking to. It's very possible he didn't know because he couldn't see who he was talking to. All those reasons lead us to believe it may have been his eyesight, but we have to understand that it wasn't just poor eyesight like, well, I can't see too good, my eyes are getting bad as I get older. You see, Paul was struck down with lightning by Christ. He was struck with blindness. Scales fell off his eyes. His eyes must have been burned as a result of this punishment. And it is possible that he never was given his full eyesight back, even when he was healed. And as a result of that, he may have suffered with weak, infected, pussy, runny eyes. That's the way the 58 Awake described it. Now, anybody that has a running infection in their body knows how that just brings down your entire immune system. It just drains you of all your energy. As a matter of fact, the Awake said that this might have given Paul an inferiority complex. Imagine that. Paul had an inferiority complex. Because he wouldn't, if you had weak, infected, pussy, runny eyes, what an ugly sight. You wouldn't even want people to look directly at your eyes. And for a man that had to do so much teaching, personal traveling, personal contact with people, it just may have been getting to the point, as the older he got, the more difficult it was for him to bear. Now, what else could this thorn in the flesh be? Well, if you look in 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 28, this is the second possible reason, and it could have been a combination of both for that matter. It says, besides those things of an external kind, there is what rushes in from me from day to day, the anxiety for all the congregations. Yes, anxiety. Paul was carrying first century Christianity on his shoulders. He was establishing congregations, writing letters. it was unbelievable the load he was carrying. We in the traveling work can't even imagine the pressures he was under. And Paul was being attacked by superfine apostles, people that made him the object, attacking weaknesses in his personality, which he obviously had like anybody else did. And when you become the center of controversy, when you're supposed to be the one healing controversy, it almost becomes an impossible situation. You have no freedom to act. And that's why Paul may have said, so that I may not feel overly exalted. He could never get high on himself. These superfine apostles never allowed him to be. They just continually caused aggravation for Paul. And it was just taking a tremendous toll on him. Well, here we've defined a very difficult, impossible problem for the Apostle Paul. He was praying to Jehovah for a miracle. He was asking for it to be removed. God did miracles in the first century. He was not out of line for asking. As a matter of fact, in verse 8 it says, in this behalf I 3 times entreated the Lord that it might depart from me. That's significant. Obviously, Jehovah didn't answer him after the first prayer. Maybe Paul felt, well, okay, I'm going to try to live with it. But it must have gotten to the point again that he didn't think he could live with it, so he prayed again to Jehovah, please remove it from me. And we don't know how much time lapsed between the second and third prayer, but it must have gotten to the point again that living with it seemed impossible, and the only way he felt he could go on and carry the responsibility he had was to have it removed. Well, finally, after the third time, Jehovah finally answered him. And what Jehovah told him proved to be of tremendous comfort to him. In verse 9, yet he really said to me, Paul, my undeserved kindness is sufficient for you, for my power is being made perfect in weakness. The words must have struck Paul like a ton of bricks. He must have intellectually known this because he was a spiritual man, but he was so emotionally involved in his own situation he never thought of it. Jehovah, in essence, was telling Paul, I know you can't go on. Paul, you haven't been able to go on for years. I've been carrying you with my spirit. I'm just letting you feel it a little bit more now. He says, my power is made perfect in your weakness. When people see you doing the work that you're doing with weak, infected, pussy eyes, and they see all the books you're writing, all the visitations that you're taking, I'll tell you, Paul, they're going to give the credit not to you. They're going to give the credit to me. They're going to know it's only by my Spirit that you could possibly do this work. And Paul said, I never really even thought about that. It's true. My weakness gives room for the manifestation of your power. So Paul responds to Jehovah and says, most gladly, therefore, will I rather boast as respects my weakness, that the power of the Christ may like a tent remain over me. Now he has not only coped with his problem, but now he has a completely different attitude toward all his problems. Look at this in verse 10. Therefore I take pleasure in weaknesses, in insults, in cases of need, in persecutions and difficulties for Christ. For when I am weak, then I am powerful. It just changed Paul's entire attitude, these words. Jehovah proved to be a God of comfort to him. What he thought he couldn't live with, he was now enduring. I guess in essence, Jehovah could have done two miracles in Paul's behalf. He could have removed the problem, or he could have taught him how to live with it. And which do you think is the greater of the two miracles? Which one do we pray for? The Apostle Paul, when a problem came that seemed to be overwhelming, he didn't get overwhelmed by it. He looked to the heavens and he said, well, Jehovah, how are you going to get me out of this one? He saw the manifestation of God's power, and Jehovah was glorified through Paul's weakness. And maybe that's the way Jehovah at times will be a God of comfort to us too. Of course, we don't have to go back 2,000 years to see how Jehovah's been a God of comfort to his people. All we have to do is read reports from around the world about our brothers and sisters in so many countries enduring persecution and abuse and neglect, and see how Jehovah has sustained them. I think all of us remember the story that came out in 79 about Nancy Yuen in solitary concentration camps in China for 21 years. I mean, who was there to encourage her? You couldn't encourage her even if you wanted to. Jehovah was a God of comfort to Nancy Yuen. That's what she says. She doesn't think she did anything spectacular. She thinks Jehovah did. And you know, when you meet this humble, simple person, you know it was Jehovah that sustained her through that kind of stress. In different countries, such as Lebanon, the wars, civil wars still continue. A few years ago, some of the traveling overseers came in, or at least one traveling overseer came in from Lebanon, and his wife. Maybe you remember some of the stories. He was saying that 1,000 bombs fall every minute, every night in Lebanon. How do you sleep at night? The traveling overseer, in giving his report, says, we dodge bullets just like the soldiers do. He says, but we'd rather die in preaching the good news than, he says, it would be the most honorable way to die. He's never missed a visit to a congregation, never missed a meeting. Jehovah must be sustaining them through that. Do you remember the story he's told about this sister who was stopped by a man with a gun? She stopped her car and he got in. He says, I want you to take me where I want to go. And she says, I'll take you wherever you want to go. But she didn't forget what she was doing. She was out in service. So she started preaching to him and he was getting annoyed. And he said, let me out. And she was glad to let him out. But before she let him out, she asked for his name and phone number and address. She says, I'll call back on you. She had a lot of moxie. And she went back and she met not him but his mother. And the mother said, are you the woman that preached to my son? She said, yes, I am. She said, you know, my son was going to kill you. But you started preaching to him and he saw that you were a good woman, so he let you live. Jehovah was a God of comfort to that sister, wasn't he? In Poland, look at what Jehovah's done there in opening up the work so many can hear the good news. It's unbelievable, the response of the Polish government. We don't care what their motives are. We're free now to preach the good news and we're going to take advantage of it. It's interesting, there was a district overseer in our circuit from Poland. He was in the district work about 18 years. This was in Maryland. And he was relating how in Poland, when we got our freedom to meet, Solidarity tried to imitate us because they're still banned. And they bought up a lot of our watchtowers. And when they would meet, they would say, we're Jehovah's Witnesses. And the guards came in. They said, you're not Jehovah's Witnesses. They said, how can you say that? Well, when we came in, we smelled smoke in the air. Jehovah's Witnesses don't smoke. And where are your men and children? When Jehovah's Witnesses meet, they meet as a family. And then the guard said, the soldier says, hold up your watchtower. They all held up their watchtowers. That they had. They bought those. And the guard said, they're all different issues. I was thinking to myself, it's a challenge enough to be a Jehovah's Witness, almost impossible to imitate us. But seriously, Jehovah has been a God of comfort to our brothers in Poland. I heard an experience, someone wrote to me about a few of the friends doing some work. This was out from California. There was a group of them meeting in the territory. And a man was watching us from the window who was very nationalistic, had a lot of hate for Jehovah's Witnesses, and he was really ready for us when we came. The woman with her book bag knocked at the door. He flung it open, held a little American flag right in front of her face, and he says, salute this and I'll give you $50. And without hesitation, she put her hand over her heart. She said the Pledge of Allegiance. She put out her hand. She said, I'd like the $50. And he was really dumbfounded. And after he turned over the money, she said, sir, I'm your local Avon representative. Just been showing some new products to people. Well, of course, when she left the house, she met all the brothers and sisters that were coming up the walk. And she excitedly told them what had happened. She says, I guess God must be protecting you. Nobody's going to break your faith. In many parts of the world, Jehovah has proved himself to be a God of comfort to us. He has in Greece, Rwanda, Central Africa. He was to Nancy Ewan. He was to the Apostle Paul. He is to many of our brothers and sisters in this country too, as I'm sure he has been to you in this hall. So you know what the message is? Hang on. Hang on. Because one day Jehovah will get us out. Well, that brings our meeting to a close for this afternoon. And I just have to tell you, both Susan and I found it an absolute pleasure to be in your company. Tuesday night I said we'd come away with more than we could bring, and that's true. You've really refreshed us. We hope we're able to do that for you in some small way. And just wanted to thank you for your loving hospitality and the support you gave us in service and your extension of friendship. Really, we just wish it wasn't 6 months before we could come back again, but you gave us in service and your extension of friendship. Really, we just wish it wasn't 6 months before we could come back again, but it'll go fast, and we'll see you at the district assembly, I guess, next, and of course at a circuit assembly, I think, before we see you again. But thank you for everything you've done for us. We really appreciate Jehovah making this such a special week for us, as well as we hope for you too. Well, let's stand. We'll close with a song.